Claire Thompson stood in the cramped kitchen of her small two-bedroom apartment, wiping her hands on her threadbare apron. The scent of homemade tomato soup filled the air, a rare treat that she had managed to scrape together with a few leftover vegetables. It was one of those meals that stretched just far enough to feed her and her 7-year-old son, Jack. Claire stirred the pot absently, her mind elsewhere, as Jack played with his well-loved set of toy cars in the living room. The winter wind howled outside, rattling the single-pane windows that never seemed to fully close. Claire glanced toward the window and saw the faint glow of lights from the house across the street. It was an old Victorian home, its grandeur faded with time and neglect. She had often seen Mrs. Eleanor Hadley, the elderly woman who lived there, shuffling to her mailbox or attending her overgrown garden. Eleanor always seemed alone, her stooped frame and slow steps carrying a sense of quiet isolation. Claire hadn't spoken to Eleanor much, aside from a polite wave or a quick hello when they happened to cross paths. But today, something stirred in Claire. Maybe it was the gnawing loneliness she felt herself, the weight of trying to keep everything together without anyone to lean on. Or maybe it was the small but persistent memory of her own mother, who used to say, "Kindness costs nothing, but it gives back everything." After dinner, as Jack tucked into his soup, Claire made up her mind. She would visit Eleanor. There was no grand plan in her mind, just a simple desire to reach out. She poured some soup into a plastic container, grabbed a loaf of bread she had baked earlier, and bundled up in her coat. "I'll be right back, sweetheart," she told Jack, kissing the top of his head. "Stay inside and keep the door locked." With the container of soup in one hand and the bread in the other, Claire trudged through the snow-covered street to Eleanor's front door. She hesitated for a moment, second-guessing herself, before raising her hand to knock. The sound of her knock echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, there was no response. Then she heard the faint shuffle of footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing Eleanor's face. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her sharp blue eyes studied Claire with mild surprise. "Good evening, Mrs. Hadley," Claire said, her breath forming clouds in the frosty air. "I'm Claire from across the street. I made some soup and thought you might like some." Eleanor's expression softened into a faint smile, though her movements were slow as she opened the door wider. "That's kind of you, dear," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "Come in before you freeze." The inside of Eleanor's home was a stark contrast to the outside. It was tidy but sparsely furnished, the rooms dimly lit with a chill that suggested she rarely used the heat. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, and framed photos of what must have been family members lined the walls. Claire placed the soup and bread on the small dining table, noticing that there wasn't much else on it besides a single well-worn placemat. "I hope you like tomato soup," she said, trying to fill the silence. Eleanor nodded and sat down, her movements careful. "It's been a long time since anyone brought me a home-cooked meal." "Thank you." They chatted for a while as Eleanor ate, their conversation starting with polite small talk, but gradually venturing into more personal territory. Eleanor mentioned her late husband, Henry, who had passed away nearly a decade ago, and how the neighborhood had changed since she first moved in. Claire spoke of Jack, her struggles as a single mother, and how hard it was to make ends meet. Though she didn't say much about her hardships, Eleanor's keen gaze seemed to pick up on the unsaid details. As the hour grew late, Claire rose to leave. "I should get back to Jack, but I'd love to stop by again sometime. Maybe you could come over for dinner one night." Eleanor looked surprised, her eyes widening slightly. "Dinner," she repeated, as though the idea were foreign to her. "I wouldn't want to impose." "It wouldn't be an imposition at all," Claire said with a warm smile. "Jack would love the company, and so would I." For a moment, Eleanor seemed to hesitate, but then she nodded. "That would be lovely. Thank you." Claire left Eleanor's house feeling lighter than she had in weeks. It wasn't much, just a small act of kindness, but it felt good to do something for someone else. As she stepped back into her own home and was greeted by Jack's eager hug, she couldn't help but think that her mother had been right. Kindness really did give back in unexpected ways. The following evening, Claire busied herself in the kitchen again. She wasn't sure why she felt so determined to follow through on inviting Eleanor for dinner, but something about the elderly woman's quiet loneliness had stayed with her. Life had a way of piling burdens on people, and Claire couldn't imagine how heavy Eleanor's must feel after years of isolation. Besides, it felt good to focus on something other than her own worries for a change. She found herself tidying up the living room and setting their small dining table with care, even pulling out the chipped but matching plates she reserved for special occasions. Jack, always curious, watched her from the couch. "Is Mrs. Hadley really coming over?" he asked, holding one of his toy cars. "I think so," Claire said, glancing at the clock. "She said she'd try to make it. Be on your best behavior, okay?" Jack grinned. "I'm always on my best behavior." Claire raised an eyebrow at him, and he laughed, darting off to put his cars away. Not long after, there was a knock at the door. Claire opened it to find Eleanor standing there, her long wool coat draped over her thin frame. She clutched a small tin in her gloved hands, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I brought something for dessert," Eleanor said, offering the tin. Claire accepted it with a smile and stepped aside. "Come in. Make yourself comfortable," Claire said. Eleanor hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. Her eyes swept over the cozy apartment, lingering on Jack, who stood shyly behind his mother. "And you must be Jack," she said, her tone softening. "Claire told me all about you." Jack nodded and gave a polite hello, "Mrs. Hadley," before retreating to the corner to watch the interaction from a safe distance. Dinner was a simple affair, spaghetti with a bit of grated cheese on top, and a salad made from what Claire had on hand. But Eleanor seemed to enjoy every bite. They talked as they ate, with Eleanor sharing snippets of her past. Claire learned that Eleanor had once been a school teacher, and that she loved literature. She spoke of her late husband with warmth and affection, though there was a trace of sadness in her voice. Jack, who usually fidgeted through meals, was uncharacteristically quiet, listening intently to Eleanor's stories. As the evening wound down, Claire opened the tin Eleanor had brought and found homemade sugar cookies inside, each one neatly shaped and sprinkled with red and green sugar crystals. Jack's eyes lit up when he saw them, and Eleanor chuckled at his enthusiasm. "It's an old recipe of mine," Eleanor explained. "I used to bake these for my students every Christmas. They were always a favorite." "They're delicious," Claire said after taking a bite. "Thank you for bringing them." When it was time for Eleanor to leave, Claire walked her to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It was really nice having you here." Eleanor nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "It was nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me." As Claire watched Eleanor walk back across the snowy street to her house, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The evening had been simple, but there was a quiet joy in it, a reminder of how meaningful even small connections could be. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor became a regular presence in Claire's life. They began to share meals a few times a week, alternating between Claire's apartment and Eleanor's house. Jack grew especially fond of Eleanor, and she seemed equally taken with him. She would bring him small gifts, books from her personal collection, or little trinkets she had kept from her teaching days. Claire noticed that Eleanor seemed to grow more animated with each visit. Her once stooped posture straightened, and her conversations became livelier. She even laughed more, a sound that Claire had never heard from her before. It warmed Claire's heart to see the change, and she realized that Eleanor had become a source of comfort for her too. One particularly cold afternoon, Eleanor invited Claire and Jack to her house for tea. While Jack explored the living room, fascinated by the collection of old books on the shelves, Eleanor and Claire sat by the fire with steaming cups of tea in their hands. "You know," Eleanor said after a pause, "I never imagined I would find such good friends at this stage of my life. You and Jack have been a blessing." Claire smiled, touched by the sentiment. "We feel the same way. You've been like family to us." Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Family," she murmured. "I suppose that's what we are in a way." It was a simple statement, but it carried a weight that Claire couldn't quite put into words. She reached over and placed a hand on Eleanor's, and for a moment, they sat in companionable silence. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them like a blanket. As Claire walked home with Jack that evening, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The struggles of her daily life hadn't disappeared, but they felt a little lighter. She hadn't expected that reaching out to Eleanor would lead to such a profound connection, but she was grateful for it. The weeks passed in a steady rhythm, with Eleanor becoming an increasingly cherished part of Claire and Jack's lives. The chill of winter softened into the first hints of spring. Yet, despite the budding greenery, Claire's financial struggles remained. Late at night, after Jack was asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table, tallying numbers and worrying about how to make ends meet. But somehow, the weight of it all felt a little lighter with Eleanor's warm presence in their lives. One Saturday morning, Eleanor arrived at the apartment unannounced, a small, elegant handbag hanging from her arm. Claire opened the door to find Eleanor dressed in her best coat, her scarf neatly tied at her neck. "Mrs. Hadley, what a nice surprise," Claire said, smiling warmly. "Come in." Eleanor stepped inside, taking in the familiar cozy space. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," she said, her tone gentle. "Not at all," Claire replied, inviting her to sit on the worn but comfortable couch. "Jack's outside playing in the courtyard with his friends. Would you like some tea?" "Perhaps later," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a rare formality. She sat down and opened her handbag, withdrawing a small envelope. "Claire, I brought something for you." Claire looked at the envelope with curiosity and a touch of apprehension. "What is it?" "Open it, dear," Eleanor urged softly, her eyes encouraging. Claire opened the envelope with trembling fingers, pulling out a neatly folded check. As her eyes fell on the amount $10,000, her breath caught for a moment. She couldn't speak. The enormity of the gesture rendered her speechless. "Mrs. Hadley," Claire finally managed, her voice shaking. "I can't accept this. This is too much." Eleanor's face softened with a knowing smile. "Claire, I've thought about this carefully. Please let me explain." Still holding the check, Claire felt overwhelmed. "But why? Why would you do this for me?" Eleanor reached over, gently taking Claire's hand. "Because you've been more than a neighbor to me. You've been a friend, a true blessing. For years, I lived in that old house feeling forgotten while the seasons changed around me. When you knocked on my door with soup that night, you didn't just bring me a meal. You brought me back to life. Since then, you and Jack have filled my days with light I thought I'd never have again." Claire's tears brimmed, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "You've shared so much of yourself with me, Claire. I see how hard you work, how you stretch every penny for Jack. I know what it means to feel like the world is on your shoulders, even if you try not to show it. When you told me about your struggles as a single mom raising Jack on your own, balancing work, and worrying about every bill, I saw a strength in you that I deeply admire. But I also saw someone who deserved a helping hand." Claire swallowed hard, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You've already done so much for me, just by being here. This is more than I could ever have imagined." Eleanor smiled, her gaze warm and firm. "I need you to know something, Claire. My husband Henry was a wise investor, and he left me with more than I could ever need. I've lived simply because there was no one in my life to share it with. Now I have you and Jack. I want to help because I can, and because you've given me something priceless, your kindness and your friendship." Claire looked down at the check, her hands trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Eleanor said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "Just use it to ease your burdens. Fix what needs fixing. Treat yourself and Jack to something special. Most of all, take a breath and give yourself the grace you so freely give others." Claire nodded, clutching the check to her chest as the weight of Eleanor's kindness washed over her. "I promise I'll use it wisely," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "That's all I ask. You've already given me so much, Claire. This is the least I can do." That evening, after Jack had gone to bed, Claire sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the check. She let herself dream for the first time in years. She thought about catching up on rent, fixing the leaky faucet, buying Jack the new shoes he desperately needed, and maybe even putting some money aside for the future. But more than anything, Claire thought about the profound kindness behind Eleanor's gesture. It wasn't just the money. It was the love and care that Eleanor had shown her. Someone had truly seen her struggles and wanted to help, not out of obligation, but because they cared. That knowledge filled her with a hope she hadn't felt in years. The next day, Claire and Jack invited Eleanor over for dinner. They laughed together, sharing stories and memories over the simple meal Claire had prepared. As Jack told Eleanor about his dreams of becoming an astronaut, Claire looked at the elderly woman who had become so much more than a neighbor. She realized, with a heart full of gratitude, that Eleanor was no longer just a kind soul from across the street. She was family in the truest sense. And as they shared their laughter and joy, Claire knew that their lives had been forever changed, not just by the gift of money, but by the power of love and connection. As spring unfolded with its blooming flowers and brighter skies, Claire found herself marveling at how her life had changed since she first knocked on Eleanor's door. The weight of her financial struggles had eased somewhat, but more than that, the companionship of her elderly neighbor had brought an unexpected lightness to her days. Eleanor had become a constant presence, not only offering support but sharing in the little moments that made life richer. One Thursday afternoon, Claire decided to surprise Eleanor with something special. Jack was at school, and she had a rare day off from her job at the grocery store. Gathering what little money she could spare, she bought a potted lavender plant, a nod to the soft floral scent that always seemed to linger in Eleanor's home. When she arrived at Eleanor's house, the older woman greeted her at the door with her usual warmth. "Claire, this is a lovely surprise," Eleanor said, stepping aside to let her in. "I thought you might like this for your garden." Claire handed over the lavender. "I know you love the scent." Eleanor's smile deepened, and she reached out to touch the small plant. "It's perfect. Thank you, dear." They spent the next hour outside planting the lavender together in a sunny corner of Eleanor's garden. The garden had started to transform under their joint care, with Jack often helping on weekends. As they worked, Eleanor shared stories from her younger days, painting pictures of a life filled with adventure and love. "You know, Henry and I used to dream about growing a garden like this," Eleanor said, her hands gently patting the soil around the lavender. "But life had other plans. It's funny how time passes, isn't it? You think you have all the time in the world." Claire paused, leaning back on her heels. "I know what you mean. Sometimes I feel like I'm running out of time to give Jack the life he deserves. It's hard trying to be everything at once." Eleanor turned to her, her expression soft but serious. "You're doing more than you realize, Claire. Jack doesn't need perfection. He needs love, and you've given him that in spades. I see it in the way he looks at you, the way he talks about you." Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. "I just want him to have opportunities one didn't. Sometimes I worry I'm not enough." Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on Claire's shoulder. "You're more than enough, and you don't have to do it alone. You have me now. Remember that." Later that day, Eleanor surprised Claire with her own gesture. When Claire returned home, she found a neatly wrapped package on her doorstep, along with a note in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. Inside the package was a cookbook filled with simple, budget-friendly recipes. The note read, "For my dear Claire, so you can cook up all the love and dreams you pour into your family." Claire felt her eyes welling up as she held the cookbook. Eleanor's kindness had a way of making her feel seen, as though every small struggle she endured mattered to someone. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor invited Claire and Jack over for tea. They sat in the newly blooming garden, sipping from delicate china cups, while Jack played nearby with a small wooden puzzle Eleanor had given him. "You've told me so much about what you want for Jack," Eleanor said, her eyes thoughtful. "But what about you, Claire? What would you want if you could have anything?" Claire hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know. I guess I'd want to go back to school. I always wanted to become a teacher, but it didn't work out." Eleanor nodded slowly. Why not now? Claire laughed softly, shaking her head. I'm barely making ends meet as it is. Going back to school feels like an impossible dream. Dreams often do, until someone shows you they're possible, Eleanor said with a knowing smile. The conversation stayed with Claire long after they returned home that night. As she sat at the kitchen table flipping through the cookbook Eleanor had given her, she allowed herself to wonder. What if she could go back to school someday? What if things could truly change? It wasn't just the money Eleanor had given her. It was the belief she instilled, the sense that Claire's life could be more than just survival. The next day, Eleanor stopped by with another surprise, a folder containing information about local teaching programs and scholarships. I've been looking into this, she said as she handed it over, just in case you decide it's not so impossible after all. Claire's hands trembled as she took the folder, her heart swelling with gratitude. You've done so much for me already, Eleanor. I don't know how I could ever repay you. Eleanor smiled, her voice warm. You already have, dear. You've given me something I thought I'd lost, a sense of purpose and a family to share it with. That's worth more than money could ever buy. As Claire flipped through the papers, a spark of hope ignited in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to dream again. As summer arrived, with Eleanor's support and her own determination, Claire had begun taking small but meaningful steps toward her dream of becoming a teacher. She started by researching part-time programs and online courses, piecing together a plan that felt achievable. The folder Eleanor had given her had become her constant companion, a tangible reminder of the possibilities that lay ahead. One sunny afternoon, Claire and Jack visited Eleanor's garden to celebrate a small milestone. Claire had just received her acceptance letter to a teaching certification program that would allow her to study in the evenings while continuing her job during the day. Eleanor greeted them with glasses of iced tea and a plate of fresh scones, her eyes sparkling with pride. This is just the beginning, Claire, Eleanor said as they sat under the shade of the garden's largest tree. I always knew you could do it. Jack, who had been listening with wide-eyed fascination, piped up, Does this mean Mommy's going to be a teacher like you were, Mrs. Hadley? Eleanor chuckled, reaching over to ruffle Jack's hair. It certainly does, Jack, and I think she's going to be a wonderful one. Claire laughed, her cheeks flushing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I still have a lot of work to do. And you'll do it, Eleanor said firmly. You've already come so far. Over the weeks that followed, Claire threw herself into her studies, balancing her coursework with her job and her responsibilities as a mother. It wasn't easy, and there were nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But Eleanor was always there, offering words of encouragement, a hot meal, or simply a listening ear when Claire needed it most. Eleanor, too, seemed to thrive in their growing bond. Her once quiet and solitary life had been replaced with laughter, activity, and a renewed sense of purpose. She and Jack spent hours together in the garden, where he proudly showed off the sunflowers he had planted with Eleanor's help. Claire often found them sitting on the porch, deep in conversation, or sharing a bowl of ice cream. One evening, as Claire walked Jack back to Eleanor's house after a trip to the library, Jack turned to her with a thoughtful expression. Mom, do you think Mrs. Hadley is lonely anymore? Claire smiled, squeezing his hand. I don't think so, sweetheart. I think we've helped each other feel a little less lonely. When they reached Eleanor's door, the elderly woman greeted them with her usual warmth. They sat together in her cozy living room, surrounded by the soft glow of lamplight and the scent of lavender. Jack curled up with a book while Claire and Eleanor talked late into the night. Their conversations flowed easily as they shared stories, dreams, and plans for the future. As the months passed, Claire began to see the ripple effects of the changes in her life. Jack was thriving, his confidence and happiness shining brighter than ever. Claire herself felt a newfound sense of purpose. Her dream of teaching was no longer just a distant hope, but a real and tangible goal. And Eleanor, who had once felt forgotten in her large Victorian house, now had a family who loved and cherished her. On a crisp autumn morning, Claire completed her first official teaching assignment as part of her certification program. She returned home beaming with pride, greeted by Jack's excited hugs and Eleanor's warm congratulations. "You're one step closer," Eleanor said, handing Claire a bouquet of flowers she had picked from the garden. "I knew you could do it." Claire felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged Eleanor tightly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Eleanor pulled back, her eyes shining. "And I couldn't have found this kind of happiness without you and Jack. We've made each other whole." As the three of them sat down for dinner that evening, their little family felt complete. Claire glanced at Eleanor and Jack, her heart swelling with gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken. She thought back to that cold winter evening when she had first knocked on Eleanor's door with a container of soup in her hands. It had been such a small act of kindness, but it had grown into something far greater, a bond that had changed all their lives forever. And as laughter filled the room, Claire realized that even in the hardest times, kindness, love, and hope could light the way and remind her that family didn't have to be defined by blood, but by the hearts willing to share it.